Alrighty, good evening. It is Jonathan Albin and NycosRPG. So glad to have you with us. Today we're going to be looking at how role-playing games have adapted, changed, modified over the years, and how the very nature of role-playing games has been maintained even as the properties themselves have made alterations over time. Now, I'm not necessarily referring to specific genres when I speak. I'm not thinking about specific properties when I speak of the evolution, although there has certainly been adaptation as different levels of sophistication have been added to role-playing. But the very concept of role-playing games has radically changed from its origins. And as a player who has been here, as a game master who has been in the role-play scene for 5 decades, I think I've got a pretty good handle on how that adaptation has gone. Of course, if you have experiences of your own that you find that where I've said something that seemed a little bit off or you have questions about it, feel free to respond either here in the chat on Twitch or when this is broadcast on YouTube in the chat, the comment section. But before we get going, make sure you know to go ahead and subscribe now so that you get no commercials. If you are watching this on Twitch, you know how every 30 minutes or so they automatically plug in commercials. But my channel has it set up so that once you subscribe, you no longer have to see another commercial. And that is arguably the best way to watch these episodes because A, they're recorded live, and yes, I make some colossal blunders, and so you'll be able to catch those live and laugh along with me, or laugh at me, I suppose. But more importantly, you won't have to put up with commercials if you are a subscriber. Additionally, if you're watching this on YouTube, please do subscribe because it's how we can, between the subscriptions and the comments and the likes, that's how the algorithm knows that you guys are appreciating the content and help us to keep this a daily channel. And we are daily right now, 2 episodes a day. Monday through Friday, 10 a.m. Pacific time, 11 p.m. Pacific time here on Twitch, and subsequently as those shows get moved up onto YouTube. All right, so let me turn off the gong, so to speak. There it is. Goodbye. All righty, so how have role-playing games adapted and changed over time? Well, the first thing to realize is that role-play games have been a thing since 1974, 75-ish time frame. Before that, certainly there were lots and lots of people who were role-playing. They just didn't call it that. There weren't any definitive rule sets that were broadly accessible and that like. But more importantly, role-playing as a categorization of games hadn't yet been devised. And although, of course, as long as there have been children, there have been people playing roles in games in your front yard, your backyard, or whatever, throughout your childhood, there was no quantification, no defining of that characteristic, or any overall concept of it being a game. So when it first was devised as such, the first one, of course, of note that anybody points at is, of course, Dungeons and Dragons. And even in the short period of time after its initial creation, there were a half dozen replica product, I would say, things that follow the same mechanistic way of handling things, although they were significantly different. There were the Melee / Wizards, which were much more tabletop referenced and fundamentally were the basics of fire and movement, similar to war games. And there were some that were virtually identical, such as Tunnels and Trolls. And of course, the major differences between them were mechanisms, whether you were using a strange polyhedral die system like Dungeons and Dragons, or if you were using more classic 6-sided dice like Melee or Tunnels and Trolls. The real emphasis on role-playing at that time was the concept of spontaneously creating a persona, and from a series of numbers beginning to define what that persona might have as a skills base. And the earliest versions, such as Dungeons and Dragons, immediately utilized a mechanism. Again, I've talked about this in several of my other videos. They functioned as the military units in a war game, and yet the very concept of playing the roles was really, really simplistic. The idea of being a fighter, you were hard pressed to come up with a reason for a specific name of your persona, except that there was also a very expansive advancing of literature in that time period, wherein people identified with the personas in stories. So the works of J.R.R. Tolkien or Michael Moorcock or Sir Arthur Conan Doyle would put a period and a place together, and these worlds, these views, whether it be science fiction worlds like Robert Heinlein or the more classic fantasy settings such as Ringworld or whatever. These concepts were simply just a template, and the persona that you built was actually defining the role. So when you rolled the numbers, if you rolled it according to the initial rules, you rolled them in a specific order, and the numeric values as defined for those specific numeric values would tell you whether you were strong or smart or fast or, wise. And those numeric values then would determine what your attributes were, what your skill sets might be. And the idea of aligning them into the classes as described, while it was mechanistically useful for establishing a positioning within a unit, it was also giving the opportunity for that creativity to come out. You were able to become that persona by beginning to consider what you would do in that role. And those early days of roleplay really were establishing the concept of the player sliding into the role. And it really was focused more on that. Now, it didn't take long. Within a couple of years, maybe even 5 years, players were already starting to modify the way they rolled the dice, modifying where they placed them. And by the time you get to advanced Dungeons and Dragons, there are alternatives where you can roll them and then place them where you want them to be and then modify them. Whereas the earlier versions had been roll the dice, modify them with species or class, and that was it. They were stuck after that. Furthermore, because of the very nature of magics being involved, it didn't take very much longer after that for the very concept of your attributes themselves no longer being static. There were books, there were artifacts, there were items that you could use to adjust those very base numbers so that you were no longer really moored to the die roll mechanism. You were no longer held to it. And one of the things that NycosRPG has kind of set down and kind of put anchors in is that the creation of the persona has more to do with what the player desires to do than what the physical characteristics demand of you. In other words, yes, you might have been, a person who has a very quick mind, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you choose to use that only for the mystical arts. So having a high intelligence, high brilliance in the case of NycosRPG doesn't mean that you have to be a magi. You don't have to pursue the way of wonders just because you are clever and quick. You might use that for learning other skills. Now, the reason for having this anchor of maintaining the original values of the persona, or to my way of thinking, at least the very concept of making yourself match what you rolled. In other words, the persona that you rolled, the numbers in the order that they were created, gives a skeleton to that being, and that being is going to be fundamentally unique for the persona that you're playing. Now, granted, with 6 attributes, there's going to be the 6 bases, if you count the 7 with the foundation. You do have variability, but you also have some stability in generalization. So if you have a high resilience, then you probably are, physically a specimen. If you have a high presence, you're definitely attractive and well endowed. Now, that's the concept here, is that the numbers then actually do define you in terms of what your appearance and your being is. And of course, then the way you play the persona gives them their personality and such. But in those early days and the early time periods when you had to play the persona as you rolled them, there were a lot of personas that got created that never got played. I remember myself having a notebook full of personas that had been rolled up and even filled in and created that never went anywhere, because I either never found a group with which that persona would gel well, or it was not necessarily a class that I personally preferred. And so that was the rank and file. Almost every player would have a half dozen personas that they didn't play. And as time went by and the players insisted on choosing what they wanted to play and playing what they had chosen, that altered the direction of the property. Now, when we talk about utilizing the traditional frameworks, realize that the demanding the player to play the numbers that are rolled does give that player perhaps a little bit of a adverse feeling about the character. And so therefore the idea is that the course of creativity that a player can pursue is not limited by what they've got on the piece of paper, because they can change and pursue whatever path they want to in terms of their character advancement. In their, again, those about 5 to 10 years into role playing, the players were now establishing the persona they wanted to play, putting the numbers where they wanted to, and have had a much more satisfactory starting point. Mechanistically, there were ways to describe what the persona had been before. There were secondary skills, mainly occupations, that a person might have pursued before they became a character in the story. And these secondary skills were functional job descriptions, but they were not anything that was normally held to as a stepping stone in any way to character development. They were just there more for flavor than anything else. To say that you were the son of a tailor was just something that you did. It wasn't that you necessarily had to use any of the skills you might have learned at home. Now, the reason NycosRPG has taken the direction of amplifying the skills nature of the game is to give much more creativity to the players, so that it will continue that adaptation process beyond where the game has gone. There are some steps that were made thereafter, though, that between then and now, that are, I think, instrumental in understanding the way role-playing games have adapted. And one of them is, of course, the online game aspect. The original role-play games, that came out in the computer world, were fundamentally text-based games, wherein you thought of an answer to a situation and you typed that in, and if the computer had that as a parametered answer, you would get, the idea of pushing the button and getting the bacon, was something that was very realistic in that sense, because you had to put in the answer the computer was looking for to get the favorable response. And so it became a matter of memorizing. I remember playing some of the original Zork adventures, and that's fundamentally pick up the bat, hit the ghost with the bat. This mechanistic way of doing role-playing games was not far and wide utilized in from the standpoint of game masters. Game masters wouldn't have given 2 seconds to that, but the individuals who were trying, even at that point, to automate the role-play mechanism and to put role-playing games into the box of a computer game were really getting sophisticated. There were those games that had associated visuals. I remember there was a game called Myst, where you were in the role play of the game. You were on this mystery island, and you could interact with the environment by turning your camera view into a direction, and then using the mouse as your hand to find out what you could trigger or activate in a space, and then the way you moved it or the way you adjusted it would give different outputs. And these first attempts like that were not necessarily intended to be role play as we think of role play today in the classic role-playing environment, because you're not playing a role, you're actually physically doing the things. You're just utilizing the mouse and the keyboard and the tools at hand to try to replicate the actions. And this, of course, led to the button mashers, where hitting this button makes the sword go a certain direction, and hitting this other button makes the other sword go in a different direction. And so then learning the combination of which buttons to hit when, left, right, A, B, left, right, up, down. That concept became the default for a majority of role-playing. And I say majority only because the numbers bear out there were far more people moving into the video games marketplace than were continuing to expand into the role-play environment, partially because of the satanic panic, and I've done a video about that, and I'm going to try to put a link to it right here. But the element of popularity of role-play games had somewhat kind of capped off in that period, and so the computer marketplace suddenly was equating itself to the world I had come from. When I was a kid and somebody said you were a gamer, they meant that you were playing a tabletop game. Chess, checkers, Monopoly, Risk, Axis and Allies, Squad Leader, Dungeons and Dragons. Those were all gamer terms. But as the computer games market kept creeping up in terms of numbers, and there was more money involved in that because the sale of these games was now a going concern, the very element that made you a gamer was redefined. So that by the time I had become a professional in the games business in the 80s and the 90s, I was constantly fighting with, I'd say I'm a professional in the games business, and they go, "Oh, which computer company do you work for?" Or, my kid plays Atari or whatever. And these elements of play had redefined it so that a person who was a gamer by definition now was a computer gamer, and you had to redefine yourself when you actually said, "No, actually, I'm talking about tabletop RPGs or tabletop board games." And in that period, the way we played also changed. And by that, I mean the very concept of being a warrior or a necromancer or a wizard was no longer a characterization. It was no longer a defining of the attitudes or even the attributes with which you played. It was merely which set of skills you were using, and which spells list, for example, you'd be able to access, and what visually cool thing you could do with your computer persona. And I think this really is what led to, in the mid 80s and into the 90s, the concept of the D20 glut, the idea of new and interesting character classes to play, was not necessarily a matter of figuring out new ways to do role play, because that's time honored, and you can see that in every movie out there. You can play a role 1,000 different ways. Look at how many times they've remade Hamlet, and there are vast differences between Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet and Mel Gibson's Hamlet. They are way different departures on the role itself, and that's indicated also in that D20 period as all these new classes and skills came out. It really wasn't about playing the persona differently. It was about new piles of isolated skills. So that if you had read something in a skills book that said that you needed to have this attribute or whatever, then now you're starting to alter the direction of the character within the game so that you can take advantage of those now called optimized alternatives. To the point now where somebody pointed out that the newest 2024 Dungeons & Dragons was actually fundamentally released at the point when it was for two gamers. One was the person who was waiting to play with his group, and all he wanted to do is make sure that the rules he was playing under were maintained, and if there were any changes, he was familiar with them. But more importantly, there were those who were actually solo players, and literally they were playing with the rules to figure out the optimization path to the best build. And I think we see that a lot with the multitude of channels out there that tell you how to play role-playing games, who are really just cloaking themselves in the how to play aspect, when really what they're saying is, here's what I would do to optimize. And in the transition from Dungeons & Dragons 3.5, and I'm going to kind of bypass 4.0 directly to 5.0, that transition, while initially was seen, especially by game masters like myself, as a return to the old ways, a reinvigorating of the game master base, and a return of the teeth that a storyteller would need to be able to keep the story moving in a direction he desired. It really was about this new concept of optimizing. The computer games industry for decades would actually sell what they called cheat books. They were code breaker, hack, if you want to, hack versions of properties so that you could optimize your play. And in certain cases, it made sense. Some of the games were so difficult to comprehend and too arcane to actually work through, so that the concept of the cheat book was simply, I want to be able to see all of the cutscenes in the video game that I paid $45 for, but I don't have the skill to play it myself. So let me see how I can get through it. And therefore I get to see all the cutscenes, and now I've made it with my $45. This mechanism really was set out generally to find ways to draw money from the consuming player. And so now when we come to the modern iteration, whether it be the slowly drifting digital nature of Dungeons & Dragons, or the raft of new games that have come out recently, Modiphius, Mothership, you name your system here. Some would even argue that Nykos gets lumped in there, but in reality, Nykos as a game master's toolbox really is in support of whatever mechanism that you play. But the concept of role-playing has changed and adapted in considerable ways that to some mind are great. Some people think that this is the greatest iteration of role-playing ever. And then others, like myself, challenge that, because role-playing under these newer mechanisms take away from the storyteller, again, the ability to moderate control of his game, and also drives the player into the purchase realm of buying the shiny things that they want for the character, rather than working with the storyteller to figure out how to get to those shiny items. There's an evidentiary example of that going on in my Monday evening RPG group, which I will talk about in a later video. But this adaptation has changed the world so that if you are looking to enter role-playing, you may want to consider looking at NycosRPG for a couple of reasons, one of which being the ease of play, the speed at which you can get to the advances you want to, and the fact that the player progression is solely in the hands of the player. The irony is that my complaints about role-play's direction have really been about how the players are given agency without accountability, and now NycosRPG does provide the accountability with the access, because as you advance the persona skills and such that you want, you're providing a reduction of the work that a game master has to, because you're advancing the direction you want to go all along the way. So I want to thank you for being with us for this half hour. I hope that I've helped to explain somewhat about the adaptations that role-playing has gone through. Make sure that if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, in order to be aware of when our videos, make sure you click on the bell so that you get notice whenever a new video is posted. And remember, you can catch us live on NycosRPG on Twitch. And as a subscriber, you don't have to watch any commercials on Twitch. So feel free to subscribe there, and also to subscribe on YouTube to get all the cool videos. I will be on again tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. and every weekday morning at 10 a.m., every weekday evening at 11 p.m. So make sure you follow us as well. And if you really like what's going on, would like to be part of the community, check out patreon.com/Nykos and join us there. That will give you access to our weekend games, Saturdays and Sundays. And I look forward to seeing you then. I'm Jonathan Albin, and this has been NycosRPG.